They called me greedy the first time I asked about my mother. It happened at my father's house on a Sunday afternoon that was supposed to be easy, the kind of day families like ours preferred no big occasions, no pressure, just food on the table and the appearance of peace. The windows were open, letting in the low hum of traffic and the smell of cut grass from the neighbor's yard. My stepmother had laid out iced tea in matching glasses, lemon slices floating like decorations. Everything looked calm. That's usually when the truth causes the most damage. Someone mentioned my mother's name in passing. Not directly. Just a reference. Back when things were simpler, my father said, staring into his glass. Before all that. I didn't plan the question. It slipped out the way honest things often do. What happened to her things, I asked. I didn't say money. I didn't say inheritance. I didn't even say will. Just things. The room shifted. My stepmother's hand paused mid-motion, her fingers still curled around the handle of a serving spoon. My younger sister stopped scrolling on her phone. My brother's foot stopped bouncing under the table. No one answered. I waited, counting the seconds in my head the way I'd learned to do in uncomfortable situations. 1, 2, 3. I added trying to sound casual photos papers. Anything personal. That was when my stepmother laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was worse than that, a small dismissive sound like she'd just heard something childish. "You've always been greedy," she said. The word landed cleanly. No hesitation. No apology. Greedy. I felt it settle somewhere behind my ribs, familiar and unwelcome. That word had followed me for most of my life, showing up whenever I asked questions no one wanted to answer. I'm not asking for anything, I said. My voice stayed even. I was proud of that. I just don't know much about her. My father cleared his throat. This isn't the time. When would be? I asked. He didn't look at me. We've talked about this. Digging into the past doesn't help anyone. My sister finally looked up from her phone. Why do you always do this? She asked, not angry, just annoyed. Everything's fine. Why can't you leave it alone? I looked around the table. No one met my eyes. That's when I understood something important. The silence wasn't confusion. It was coordination. I was 1 year old when she died, I said quietly. I don't even know what she liked, or what she left behind. My stepmother set the spoon down with deliberate care. You were raised here, she said. You had a home. You had stability. Do you really want to risk that over questions that don't matter anymore? There it was, the warning disguised as concern. I felt my jaw tighten. Knowing who my mother was matters to me. My father finally looked up. His expression wasn't angry. It was tired. You always want more, he said. More answers, more explanations. It comes off selfish, greedy, selfish, different words, same message. I pushed my chair back slightly. The legs scraped against the tile loud in the sudden quiet. I didn't realize asking about my own mother was a problem. My stepmother sighed. No one said that. You just did, I replied. She shook her head. You're reading into things. We've all moved on. You should too. Moved on. From a woman I never got to know. I stood suddenly aware of how small the room felt. I'm sorry, I said out of habit, more than sincerity. I didn't mean to make this uncomfortable. No one stopped me as I walked toward the door. Behind me, conversation resumed almost immediately. Lower voices, careful laughter, the clink of glasses. Relief. The disturbance had been removed. Outside, the air felt cooler. I stood on the porch for a moment, listening to the screen door close behind me, sealing the house back into itself. Greedy. That word echoed on the drive home. It always did. Growing up, I'd learned early which questions were acceptable and which ones earned that label. Anything about my mother fell into the second category. Anything about the years before my stepmother arrived. Anything about paperwork records or how things were handled. When I was little, I accepted it. Adults know best, I told myself. They're protecting me. When I got older, the explanations changed. Why dwell on sad things? Some answers only cause pain. You should be grateful for what you have. Gratitude became the price of silence. My father remarried when I was still small enough to be carried on one hip. My stepmother brought order into the house, schedules, traditions, matching outfits for school photos. She was efficient, practical, and deeply invested in keeping the family story clean. I didn't question it then. Why would I? My siblings, her children with my father, grew up with certainty. About who they were, about what belonged to them, about what the future held. I grew up learning how to fit myself into the corners. Whenever extended family came over, stories were told about the early days. My father would gloss over them quickly, redirecting the conversation before details settled. My stepmother handled questions with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. And if I asked, "Well, that's not important now. You don't need to worry about that." "Why are you so focused on what's gone?" By the time I was a teenager, I'd stopped asking in public. It was easier to let the moments pass than to feel the room turn against me. The label followed me anyway. When I wanted to know why certain decisions were made without me, I was greedy. When I wondered why family documents were kept locked away, I was greedy. When I asked why my siblings seemed to know things I didn't, I was greedy. It became a shorthand explanation. A way to dismiss curiosity without engaging with it. By my 20s, I'd started to believe it. Maybe I was asking for too much. Maybe some people were meant to accept what they were given and move on. That belief kept me quiet for years. Until that afternoon. Until I saw how quickly my family closed ranks over one simple question. On the drive home, I replayed the moment again and again. The pause before the answer. The way my stepmother hadn't hesitated. The way my father had avoided my eyes. It wasn't embarrassment. It was fear. I pulled into my apartment complex and sat in the car with the engine off, hands still on the steering wheel. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. A door slammed. Normal sounds. Ordinary life. Inside my chest, something unsettled. I thought about my mother, my real mother. The one whose face I only knew from a single faded photograph tucked into an old book. The one no one spoke about unless they had to. I thought about how strange it was that asking about her belongings had triggered such a strong reaction. Things don't frighten people. Paperwork does. That night I lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling fan as it cut slow circles through the dark. I told myself to let it go, to be reasonable, to keep the peace. But another thought kept intruding, steady and unwelcome. If there was nothing to hide, they wouldn't have needed to shut me down. And if one quiet question could make me the villain at my own family's table, then whatever they were protecting had been worth hiding for a very long time. I learned early that silence was rewarded, not with affection exactly, but with peace. And in my family, peace was the highest currency. It meant meals without tension, holidays without arguments, a sense that everything was normal even when it wasn't. My mother died when I was barely old enough to walk. I don't remember her voice. I don't remember her face except from that single photograph creased at the edges, her smile half faded tucked into the pages of an old cookbook that somehow survived every move we made. No one ever told me why it was there or how it avoided being thrown out like so many other things from that time. When my father remarried, life reorganized itself quickly. My stepmother believed in structure. She ran the house the way some people run a business, efficiently, decisively, with very little tolerance for sentiment. She replaced old furniture, old routines, old habits. Family photos were rearranged. New traditions were introduced. The past was folded neatly away like something seasonal that didn't need to be displayed anymore. I adapted because that's what children do. I learned which questions earned smiles and which earned tight looks. I learned that mentioning my mother made conversations end sooner than planned. I learned that asking why too many times made adults impatient. So I stopped. At school, teachers described me as quiet, easy, mature for my age. At home, I was praised for being low maintenance, for not causing trouble, for understanding that some things didn't need to be discussed. My siblings didn't have to learn those lessons. They grew up confident, loud in the easy way children are when they know they're allowed to take up space. They asked questions without hesitation. They expected answers. And they got them. When family decisions were made where we'd go on vacation, what renovations would happen, how money would be spent, I was usually informed after the fact. Not excluded outright. Just not included. At first I thought it was age, then I thought it was personality. Eventually I realized it was something else. When I was about 10, I remember finding a box in the hallway closet while looking for a pair of gloves. It was old, the cardboard softened with age, sealed with tape that had yellowed and cracked. My name wasn't on it. No one's was. I didn't open it. I stood there for a long moment, my fingers resting on the lid, feeling like I was touching something forbidden. Then I heard footsteps and slid the box back where it was, my heart racing. Later that day, the box was gone. When I asked my father about it, he smiled too quickly. "Just old paperwork," he said. "Nothing you need to worry about." I nodded and didn't ask again. That was the pattern. Whenever something from the past surfaced, it disappeared just as quickly. Old letters, documents, a piece of jewelry I vaguely remembered seeing once on my father's dresser. It was easier not to notice. By the time I reached my teens, the story of our family was well established. My father and stepmother worked hard. They provided stability. They'd built something solid together. The past was messy, sad, and best left alone. I believed them. Believing them kept things simple. In high school, when friends talked about their parents' divorces, their complicated family histories, their inheritance dramas, I stayed quiet. I didn't feel entitled to any of that information about myself. It wasn't mine to ask for. That belief followed me into adulthood. When my siblings started talking about future plans, college funds, business ideas, opportunities, I didn't fully understand. I listened politely. Sometimes I was invited into the conversation. Sometimes I wasn't. If I asked where the money was coming from, my stepmother would wave it off. "Family resources," she'd say. "Don't worry about it." And I didn't. I told myself I was independent, that I didn't need help, that I preferred standing on my own. What I didn't admit even to myself was that independence had been trained into me, encouraged because it was convenient, because it kept expectations low. Every so often, curiosity crept back in. A question about my mother's maiden name. A question about how long my parents had known each other before she died. A question about why certain records weren't available online. Each time the response was the same. Why does that matter? You're focusing on the wrong things. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Harder for whom I learned to ask myself that silently, never out loud. As the years passed, my siblings grew more comfortable with the idea that everything in our family was shared except information. They spoke confidently about what was ours, the house, the savings, the future. I noticed I was never included in those sentences, not directly excluded, just omitted. And when I noticed, I corrected myself, told myself I was being sensitive, that this was just how families worked. Silence was easier than confrontation. Silence kept me welcome at the table. Looking back, I can see how carefully that silence was maintained. How every unanswered question, every gentle dismissal, every reminder to be grateful added another layer to the story they wanted me to accept. I wasn't being protected. I was being managed. But at the time, I didn't have the words for that. I only knew that speaking up made things uncomfortable and being quiet made them smooth again. So I stayed quiet. Until the day I didn't. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from realizing you're the only one missing a piece of the story. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in slowly, showing up in moments that don't seem important at the time. Like the first time I noticed my siblings using phrases I'd never heard before. Our account. The trust. When things are transferred. They said those words casually, the way people do when something has always existed in their world. We were sitting in the living room, the television on, but ignored sunlight slanting across the carpet. My sister was flipping through paperwork spread neatly on the coffee table, color-coded tabs, marking sections she seemed to understand instinctively. I didn't ask what it was, I just listened. At some point, my brother mentioned a meeting they'd had earlier that week. He spoke like I should already know about it. When he realized I didn't, He looked briefly confused, then shrugged. "Dad probably forgot to tell you," he said. "Probably." That word did a lot of work in my family. I told myself it didn't matter, that whatever they were talking about wasn't relevant to me, that I'd made my own way and didn't need to be involved in family logistics. But something about the ease with which they discussed it stayed with me. Over the next few months, I started noticing patterns I couldn't unsee. When extended family visited, conversations shifted when I entered the room. Not dramatically, just enough. A sentence cut short. A subject changed. Someone suddenly remembering they needed another drink. Once at a cousin's wedding, an aunt I barely knew leaned in close and said, "You must be so proud of how things turned out." For who I asked. She blinked. "Oh, I just assumed you knew." She didn't elaborate and I didn't push. Old habits die hard. But that moment lingered. It wasn't suspicion yet. More like an awareness. A sense that there was a shared understanding circulating around me, passing through conversations and decisions, without ever stopping long enough for me to grasp it. I began paying attention in quiet ways. When my father mentioned paperwork, I noticed how quickly my stepmother stepped in to handle it. When mail arrived, addressed in unfamiliar handwriting, I noticed how it disappeared into her desk drawer before anyone else could see it. Once, while helping clean out the garage, I came across a folder tucked behind a row of paint cans. It was labeled with my mother's maiden name. My heart jumped. I picked it up, fingers trembling slightly, and flipped it open. It was empty, no papers, no notes, just a single indentation on the inside cover, as if something had been pressed there for a long time, and then removed. I held it for a moment, then put it back exactly where I'd found it. That night, I couldn't sleep. It finally occurred to me that my ignorance wasn't accidental. It had been maintained. I started thinking back over the years, re-examining moments I'd dismissed as nothing. The way my stepmother always volunteered to handle anything official. The way my father deferred to her whenever documents were involved. The way my siblings spoke with confidence about matters I'd never been invited to discuss. I wasn't forgettable. I was inconvenient. And that realization was more unsettling than anger would have been. Because it meant someone had made a decision long ago. A quiet one. To keep me out of certain rooms. To keep certain words from ever being spoken in my presence. I didn't know why yet, but I knew it wasn't about protecting me. The turning point came during a family gathering I hadn't planned to attend. A small thing. A birthday dinner for my father held at a restaurant he liked because it made him feel important. White tablecloths, overpriced wine, the kind of place where servers call everyone sir and ma'am no matter how familiar they become. I arrived late, sliding into my seat while dessert menus were being passed around. Conversation resumed around me as if I'd never left. My sister was talking animatedly about future plans. My brother nodded along. My stepmother smiled, her hand resting lightly on my father's arm. "At least we'll have everything settled by then," my sister said. "Settled?" I asked before I could stop myself. She glanced at me, then at our parents. "You know, the arrangements." I didn't know. My father cleared his throat. "It's nothing you need to worry about." That phrase again. Something in me hardened. I keep hearing that, I said. But it seems like everyone else knows what's going on. The table went quiet in that careful, practiced way. My stepmother's smile didn't falter, but her eyes sharpened. "You're imagining things." "No," I said. "I don't think I am." My brother shifted uncomfortably. "Why are you making this awkward?" he asked. Because it already was, I thought. I just hadn't been allowed to notice. "I just want to understand," I said. "It feels like there's a whole part of this family I'm not included in." For a moment, no one spoke. Then my stepmother leaned in, slightly lowering her voice, as if she were doing me a favor. "You've always had a tendency to fixate," she said, "on things that aren't meant for you." The words were soft. The message wasn't. My father nodded. "You should focus on your own life," he added. "That's what you're good at." I looked at my siblings. Neither of them met my eyes. That was when it became clear. Whatever this was, whatever history, paperwork, or arrangements existed, it belonged to everyone else, and the fact that I didn't know about it wasn't an oversight, it was the plan. Once a word sticks, it does most of the work for you. In my family, that word was greedy. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't hurled in anger. It was used the way people use labels they think are factual, settled beyond debate. A description, not an insult. Something said with a sigh or a small shake of the head as if it explained everything that needed explaining. Whenever I asked about the past, I was greedy. Whenever I noticed inconsistencies, I was greedy. Whenever I wondered aloud why I didn't seem to know the same things my siblings did, I was greedy. The label came with consequences. It made people stop listening. I started to see how carefully it was deployed, not all at once, not aggressively. Just often enough to keep me second-guessing myself. If I brought up my mother, my stepmother would purse her lips and say, "You always focus on what you didn't get." If I mentioned paperwork or records, my father would remind me that family isn't about transactions. If I pressed further, someone would eventually say it outright. Don't be greedy. It framed curiosity as a character flaw. And because I didn't want to be that person, the selfish daughter, the ungrateful one, I learned to back off. Over time, the word began to work on me even when no one said it out loud. I'd feel it before I spoke. A tightening in my chest, a hesitation, a question forming and then dissolving before it ever reached my mouth. I told myself I didn't need to know everything, that asking too much was childish, that grown-ups accepted what they were given. That belief didn't come from nowhere, it was reinforced. When my siblings talked about plans, investments, long-term goals, things they were positioning for, I stayed quiet. If I showed interest, I was told not to worry about adult matters. If I asked for clarification, the conversation would drift away from me, leaving me sitting there with the feeling that I'd overstepped. I learned to nod at the right moments. I learned to smile when decisions were announced without my input. I learned to excuse myself when discussions turned technical, because my presence made things tense. At first I told myself this was maturity. Later I realized it was conditioning. The more I stayed quiet, the smoother things became. Holidays went better. Dinners lasted longer. My stepmother praised me for being easy. My father said he appreciated that I didn't make things complicated. Being uncomplicated was the role they'd chosen for me, and the word greedy was the guardrail that kept me there. I remember one afternoon years earlier when my father mentioned updating some documents. Nothing specific, just a comment about getting things in order. My sister immediately leaned forward, interested, asking questions about timelines and next steps. I waited. When I asked a single follow-up what kind of documents, my stepmother's expression changed. "Why do you always go there?" she asked, her tone weary. "Go where I said." "To money," she replied. "It's not a good look." I felt heat rise to my face. "I didn't mention money." She waved a hand. "You don't have to." The implication was clear. The conversation moved on without me. I sat there nodding, wondering how many times that exact sequence had played out without my fully noticing. How many small moments had reinforced the same message. Don't ask, don't press, don't want. It wasn't that they never spoke about finances or plans. They just spoke about them selectively. In rooms I wasn't always invited into. In conversations that assumed I either wouldn't understand or shouldn't be involved. And whenever I tried to bridge that gap, the label was waiting. Greedy. It was effective because it wasn't shouted. It was said with disappointment, with concern, with the suggestion that my curiosity was somehow unbecoming. I didn't want to be seen that way. So I learned to manage myself. I learned to preemptively shut down my own questions. To remind myself that peace was more important than answers. That harmony mattered more than clarity. That belief kept me comfortable. It also kept me ignorant. I see that now. At the time, I thought I was choosing restraint, that I was being respectful, that I was protecting relationships by not insisting on things that clearly made everyone uncomfortable. What I didn't see was how one-sided that protection was. No one worried about making me uncomfortable. No one hesitated to let me sit through conversations where I was clearly out of the loop. No one stopped to ask whether I might deserve the same information my siblings received. The word greedy absolved them of that responsibility. If I was greedy, then they weren't secretive. If I was selfish, then they weren't excluding me. If I was the problem, then nothing else needed to be examined. It was a neat solution, and for a long time it worked, until the day I realized how much effort it took to keep me quiet. The tension, the careful wording, the rehearsed responses. People don't work that hard to protect something insignificant. That understanding didn't make me angry right away. It made me curious in a different way, a sharper way. The kind of curiosity that doesn't announce itself. I stopped asking questions out loud. I started listening. Once I stopped asking questions out loud, things changed. Not around me, within me. I began to notice details I'd trained myself to ignore. Small things, ordinary things. The kind of details people overlook when they believe a story is settled and safe. It started with mail, not dramatic envelopes, not legal-looking packages, just a few pieces that didn't quite fit. Return addresses I didn't recognize, names written out more fully than usual. My stepmother always intercepted them first, stacking them neatly by the door before anyone else had a chance to look. I noticed how quickly she sorted through them, how nothing ever lingered on the counter, how the shredder in her office seemed to run more often than necessary. I told myself it was coincidence. Then there was the filing cabinet. It sat in the corner of my father's study, a heavy metal thing that had been there as long as I could remember. I'd assumed it held tax records, manuals, warranties, the boring, responsible paperwork of adult life. One afternoon, while helping my father move some furniture, I saw the bottom drawer slightly ajar. Inside were folders labeled with years. Most of them were recent. One wasn't. It bore my mother's maiden name. I didn't pull it out. I didn't even touch it. I just memorized the color of the folder, the way the tab was bent, the faint indentation where a label must have once been. Later that day, the drawer was closed. The next time I looked, that folder was gone. That was when coincidence stopped being convincing. I began replaying moments from the past with new attention. The way my stepmother had once corrected a family friend who referred to my mother as your late wife instead of your first wife. The way my father changed the subject whenever someone mentioned dates from before his remarriage. The way no one could ever quite answer a simple question about timing. How long after she died did you sell the house? Did she have family nearby? Who handled her affairs? The answers when they came were vague, rounded off, convenient. I started keeping mental notes, no lists, no records, just observations filed away where no one else could see them. Then came the comment that changed everything. It happened during a conversation I wasn't part of. I was passing through the hallway when I heard my stepmother speaking on the phone in the kitchen. Her voice was low-controlled. "We just need to make sure nothing surfaces," she said, "especially not her name." I froze. Her name, not his, not theirs. Hers. I waited, my pulse loud in my ears, but she lowered her voice further and I couldn't hear the rest. A moment later, she laughed softly, the sound she used when she wanted to sound reassuring. I stepped back before she could see me. That night, I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling, replaying the sentence over and over. People don't worry about names unless names are attached to something. Records, rights, ownership. The idea settled slowly, bringing with it a strange calm. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't ask follow-up questions. I didn't change my behavior at all. I waited. Time has a way of loosening things people think are secure. Conversations repeat. Details slip. Patterns reveal themselves to anyone paying close enough attention. Weeks later, my father mentioned an appointment in passing. "Just some paperwork to update," he said. "Nothing major." My sister nodded knowingly. I said nothing. But later, when I was alone, I searched the county records online. It took longer than I expected. The system wasn't designed to be friendly. Old documents were scanned poorly, dates sometimes mismatched. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. I only knew the name. My mother's maiden name. It appeared once. Just once. on a document filed decades earlier. The scan was faint, the ink blurred at the edges, but it was there, clear enough to recognize. My breath caught. The document referenced a trust, no details, no amounts, just the existence of it. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, afraid the page would vanish if I blinked. Everything I'd been told, the dismissals, the labels, the warnings clicked into place. It wasn't about my curiosity. It was about control. They hadn't been protecting me from pain. They'd been protecting themselves from exposure. The trust was real, and somehow, impossibly, it had never been mentioned to me. I closed the laptop and sat back, letting the weight of it settle. For the first time, the word greedy lost its power. Because greed implies taking something that isn't yours, and this, whatever it was, had always been tied to my name. They'd just counted on me never finding out. I didn't sleep after that, not because I was afraid, but because something fundamental had shifted. Once you see a crack in a story you've lived inside your whole life, you can't unsee it. The walls might still be standing, but you know now they're hollow. The trust document stayed open on my laptop until dawn. I read the same lines over and over, searching for something that would tell me I'd misunderstood. A typo, a coincidence. Another explanation that didn't involve deliberate omission. There wasn't one. The name was right. The date was right. The filing location matched where my parents lived at the time. And suddenly so many things made sense. Why my stepmother controlled paperwork so tightly. Why my father shut down conversations about the past. Why the word greedy appeared the moment I got too close. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a strategy. I didn't confront them the next day or the next week. That was the hardest part, carrying knowledge that changed everything while acting like nothing had changed at all. I smiled at family dinners. I answered messages. I listened while my siblings talked about their plans, their futures, the things they assumed were already settled. Inside, I was listening to something else. The past, finally speaking back. I started gathering information carefully, the way people do when they know the truth will be contested. County archives, old probate notices, public records that hadn't been digitized properly. I took days off work under the excuse of being busy, driving to offices where the air smelled like dust and toner and old paper. Clerks didn't ask questions. They never do. They just pointed me toward filing cabinets and microfilm readers, their voices flat from repetition. It took time, but eventually the story came together. My mother had died suddenly. There had been no long illness, no slow preparation. She'd been young, younger than I am now. The trust had been set up shortly before her death, naming me as the sole beneficiary with clear instructions. I was to receive it when I turned 18. That birthday had come and gone without a word. There were signatures on the documents I didn't recognize at first. Then I did. My father's. My stepmother's. They'd amended things. Delayed things. Reframed things. Always with language that sounded responsible, protective, temporary. But temporary had stretched into decades. I sat in my car afterward, documents spread across the passenger seat, sunlight bleaching the ink until it almost disappeared. My hands shook not from anger, but from clarity. They hadn't just lied. They'd waited me out. They'd assumed that by the time I was old enough to ask the right questions, I'd been trained not to. That realization hurt more than the deception itself, because it meant every conversation, every dismissal, every accusation of greed had been intentional. A way to keep me small enough not to threaten the plan. I drove home slowly, taking side streets I'd never noticed before. The world felt oddly quiet, like it does after a storm passes, but before anyone steps outside to assess the damage. That evening, my stepmother called. Her voice was light, casual. "Just checking in," she said. "We're thinking of doing a small family meeting soon, to get everyone on the same page." I almost laughed. Instead, I said, "That sounds like a good idea." She paused. "Just long enough?" "Good," she said. "We'll let you know." After we hung up, I sat on my couch, the documents spread out in front of me again. I thought about my mother not as a symbol, but as a person. A woman who had taken the time to put something aside for her child, knowing she wouldn't be there to protect it herself. She'd trusted the wrong people, but she'd trusted the law, and the law had been waiting. I called a lawyer the next morning, not a loud one, not a dramatic one. The kind of lawyer whose office was quiet and whose questions were precise. He listened without interrupting, flipping through copies of the documents I'd brought with me. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me carefully. "They knew exactly what they were doing," he said. I nodded. "I know." "You have options," he continued. "Several." I thought of all the years I'd stayed quiet, all the times I'd backed down to keep the peace, all the moments I'd been told not to want too much. "I want the truth on record," I said, "and I want control over what was left to me." He studied me for a moment, then smiled slightly. "That can be arranged." As I left his office, I felt something loosen inside me. Not rage, not triumph, resolve. The past had finally spoken back, and this time I was listening. The family meeting was scheduled for a Saturday. Of course it was. My stepmother loved weekends for anything important. Fewer excuses, fewer places to hide. She texted the details like it was a dinner invitation, time, place, casual tone. Nothing serious, just a conversation. That was the first lie. I arrived early not out of politeness but habit. The house looked the same as it always had. Trimmed hedges, fresh paint, everything arranged to suggest stability, permanence. Inside, my stepmother had already set out coffee and pastries, the good kind she saved for company. My father sat at the head of the table, flipping through papers he pretended not to be nervous about. My siblings arrived together, talking easily, unaware they were walking into a room that would never feel the same again. We sat. My stepmother clasped her hands and smiled. "We just thought it would be good to make sure everyone understands the plan moving forward." The plan. I watched my siblings lean in slightly. This was familiar territory for them. My father cleared his throat. "As you know," he began, "we've been reviewing our estate planning, making sure everything's organized." I nodded. My stepmother continued. "We want to avoid confusion later. Make things fair, transparent, fair." That word used to mean something to me. She slid a folder across the table. Not to me, to my sister. Inside were charts, summaries, clean explanations. Assets broken down. Future distributions outlined. Everything presented as logical, reasonable. I noticed immediately what wasn't there. No mention of my mother. No mention of the trust. My sister skimmed the pages, satisfied. My brother nodded along. My stepmother turned to me. "Do you have any questions?" I took a breath. "I do," I said. The room tightened. I found the trust, I continued calmly. No one moved. My father's face drained of color so fast it startled me. My stepmother's smile didn't disappear, but it froze like something caught mid-performance. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. I placed my own folder on the table and opened it. Copies of documents neatly arranged. Dates highlighted. Names underlined. My mother created a trust, I said. For me. I was supposed to receive it at 18. Silence. My brother looked between us, confused. "Is that true?" My father stared at the table. My stepmother recovered first. "You're misunderstanding legal language," she said. "It was never finalized." "That's not what the records show," I replied, "nor what the county archive confirms." She turned to my father. "Tell her." He didn't. The quiet stretched. My sister frowned. "Why wouldn't we know about this?" My stepmother's voice sharpened. "Because it was complicated." "No," I said, "because it was inconvenient." That was the moment the room changed. My stepmother's composure cracked. "You always do this," she snapped. "You twist things. You make everything about what you think you're owed. Greedy." There it was again. I was owed honesty, I said, and what my mother left me. My father finally spoke. His voice was hoarse. "We were protecting the family." "From me?" I asked. He didn't answer. My siblings looked stunned, now realization creeping in. They weren't angry yet, just unsettled. I stood. "I'm not here to argue," I said. "I've already spoken to an attorney. The trust is valid. And I'll be taking control of it." My stepmother pushed back her chair. "You can't do this. I already am," I replied. For the first time in my life, no one interrupted me. I spent years being told my questions made me greedy, I continued. But greed was never the problem. Fear was. And silence was easier than telling me the truth. My father looked up then, eyes glassy. We thought, if we waited long enough, I'd stop asking. I finished. He nodded. I closed my folder. This conversation is over. I walked out while they were still trying to find words. Outside, the air felt lighter than it ever had. Not because I'd won, but because the truth was no longer mine to carry alone. They could call it betrayal if they wanted. I called it accountability. I didn't hear from them for a while after that. Not my father, not my stepmother, not my siblings. The silence was different this time. It wasn't the kind that kept the peace. It was the kind that follows a truth no one knows how to argue with yet. Life went on anyway. It always does. I met with my attorney again the following week. The process was slower than I expected, not because it was complicated, but because it had been delayed for so long. Forms had to be refiled, notices sent, corrections made to records that should have been updated decades ago. Each signature felt oddly anticlimactic. No fireworks, no dramatic speeches, just the quiet work of restoring something that should never have been taken. The trust wasn't extravagant. It wasn't life-changing money in the way people imagine. But it was intentional, thoughtful, carefully structured to support a child my mother knew she wouldn't be around to raise. College funds, emergency reserves, a modest safeguard against exactly the kind of instability I'd spent years navigating alone. Reading through the documents, I felt something close to grief, but not the kind I'd expected. It wasn't about losing my parents' approval. It was about realizing how much my mother had tried to protect me even in death. She had planned, she had prepared, she had trusted. That trust had been misplaced, but not erased. My siblings reached out first. My brother called late one evening. His voice was unsure, stripped of its usual confidence. I didn't know he said. I swear. "I believe you," I replied. And I did. He asked questions then, real ones, about timelines, about what had been hidden, about why no one had ever told him either. I answered honestly without blame. We talked for a long time. My sister's message came days later, short, careful. She said she felt blindsided, that she needed time to process, that she hoped we could talk eventually. I told her I was open to that. What I didn't say was that openness didn't mean obligation. My father waited the longest. When he finally called, his voice sounded older, smaller. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said. I sat quietly listening. "We thought we were doing the right thing," he continued. "Keeping things stable, making sure everyone was taken care of. Everyone except me," I said. There was a pause. "Yes," he admitted. "Everyone except you." That honesty, late as it was, mattered. "I don't hate you," I told him. "But I can't pretend this didn't happen." He understood that. I could hear it in the way he didn't argue. The house changed hands quietly. Not through confrontation, not through spectacle, just paperwork and deadlines and the slow unraveling of assumptions. My stepmother never apologized. She didn't have to. Her actions had spoken clearly enough. Months passed, seasons shifted, life adjusted. The word greedy stopped echoing in my head. It had no place there anymore. What I kept from all of this wasn't anger, it wasn't satisfaction, it was clarity. I learned that silence isn't always peace. That being easy often means being overlooked. That families don't fall apart because someone asks questions, they fall apart because someone is afraid of the answers. I learned that wanting the truth doesn't make you selfish, and protecting yourself doesn't make you cruel. Most of all, I learned that the stories we're given as children don't have to be the ones we live by forever. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't forgiving quietly or enduring gracefully. Sometimes it's standing up and saying, "This was meant for me, and I'm done pretending otherwise." If you're listening to this and it sounds familiar, if you've ever been the one told not to ask, not to press, not to want too much, I hope you take something from my story. You're not wrong for noticing, you're not wrong for remembering, and you're not wrong for choosing yourself when no one else did. If this story made you think of someone or reminded you of a moment you've carried quietly for years, I'd love to hear about it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Read others. You'll find you're not as alone as you might think. And if you'd like to keep listening to stories like this, stories about truth, resilience, and what happens when the quiet ones finally speak, consider subscribing. Thank you for being here.